Have you ever been to a wine tasting and seen someone carrying on dramatically over their own ritual? Or watched a spoof of wine tasting on TV or in film? You know what I'm talking about, the whole ritual of tasting wine, the whole swirling, the eyeballing, the slurping, the spitting, the pontificating. Well, we can leave out pontificating, but there are some rituals that professional wine tasters go through for good practical reasons. We have to understand our palates, how they work, how we perceive wine, and how to converse about wine. So in this lecture, we'll define terms, we'll go through the whole process of tasting wine, and dispel some myths about wine. So take a wine. It could be red, or it could be white. Here I have a Chablis, which is a white wine from the region of Burgundy in France. Now, I don't care if you've been trained in some class or read up on how to taste wine. I'm just going to conduct a test. So I want you to just pick up a glass with wine and take a sip. No swirling, no thinking, no savoring. Just kick it back. Just a sip, mind you. This is how most of us consume when we're at a bar or when we're at a wedding and so forth. So how does it taste? How much do you remember how much it tasted? So I want you to remember that experience. Okay, now on how to taste like a professional. First, to taste properly, you're going to need to make sure the environment that you're tasting in is free from other strange aromas and other influences. You'll want to forego any strong perfumes or colognes, which will interfere with your perception of the aromas and the flavors. Next, we have the 5 S's of tasting. We have see, swirl, sniff, sip, and savor. And these form our basic toolkit. See. So why do we need to see a wine? Actually, looking at a wine can tell you a lot about it. It can tell you how old the wine is, and perhaps can give clues to the grape variety or style, or whether the wine has any faults, which something like being oxidized, which we'll cover later. But the bottom line here is that it can give you clues about how it's going to taste. Now, in order to properly look at a wine, what you're going to need is either a white piece of paper, a white napkin, or a white tablecloth. And you tilt the glass over the white surface. And when you do this, you look at the color in the middle of the glass, which we call the core, versus the color towards the meniscus, or where the rim meets the glass, because that's going to be a very different color. The reason we do this is to compare the core in the middle of the glass versus the rim near the lip of the glass. So what color is it? In wine, there is a positive rainbow of colors. So how do you communicate this? Let's say it's a red. This isn't as easy as it sounds. Some might call it red, some might call it ruby, some garnet, some brick. But what's the right term? There really isn't a right term, but you do need to be able to communicate consistently with people so that they know what you're talking about. For example, if someone looked at a very youthful wine and said to me that the color is garnet, that would suggest to me that it looks brick red, something with a little orange hue to it. To me, that may imply that a wine has some age on it, when the person was really trying to communicate that it was a youthful wine. So you need to communicate consistently. Now, for the MW exam, I would call a yellow wine, or a wine yellow color for white, was straw. And I would qualify the red you see in red wine as ruby. And this is where I formed my basic color, so it's ruby. After that, you look at the brightness of that color. Is it a pale straw, pale ruby, or is it a deep ruby, or a deep straw? And then you have to look at the different hues to the wine. So let's say, for example, white, you're going to look at some green tones to gold tones. And for red wines, it's going to have either a bluish, purplish kind of tint to it, to something more brown or tawny. Now, as white wines age, they gain color and move towards the gold end of the spectrum, while red wines lose their color and they go from those dark purple hues to brown tawny ones. This has to do with oxidation and the polymerization of polyphenols, which we will talk about later. Now, the best way to learn about color is simply just by taking note of them. So make sure that C is part of your wine tasting ritual. As a side note, you may have heard people say, wow, this wine has great legs. Just look at the wine's legs. What they mean by legs are these tears that come down in the wine. And that happens when you swirl the wine around. Now, it's a myth that these tears are linked to quality, although you'll hear that quite often. Also, sometimes in white wines, you'll see what looks like little pieces of glass at the bottom of the bottle, or sometimes in the bottom of your glass. This is not glass, and there is nothing wrong with your wine. These crystals are simply harmless tartrate crystals that will form in your glass if the wine is too cold for too long. Sometimes they disappear when the wine warms up, though. Now that we've taken note of the wine's appearance, we go to the next S, which is swirl. Now, before you start, I want you to do a test. Hopefully you just kept your wine relatively still, just tilting to look at the color. I want you to do the chest, chin, nose test. And we'll do this quite a bit in the lectures. Smell your wine from right here. Can you smell anything? That can give you an indication that it's an aromatic grape variety, if you can smell it from here. Then you can bring it up to your chin. Can you smell any more? And then what I want you to do is stick your nose in the glass. That's the chest, chin, and nose test. But what swirling does, it's going to make a big difference. Swirling actually releases more aromas into the wine, or into the glass, I should say, and allows you to smell so much more. Now, swirl the wine again and see if you can do the chest, chin, nose. You can probably smell so much more. But for older wines, it's a myth that you have to be swirling continuously, because sometimes for older wines, it's not good for it. Now on to the third S, sniff. Now some wines are more aromatic than others. To test how aromatically intense it is, that's where the chest, chin, nose test comes into play. I swirl my wine and I hold it near my chest. If you can smell it, right there, it's an aromatic grape variety. Then I hold it at my chin, and then I stick my nose in the glass and take a large sniff. Now, it doesn't have to make a ton of noise, but sniff in such a way that you can really draw in as much aroma as you can. When a wine is particularly aromatic, we say it is aromatically intense, or it is, if it's particularly floral, it's perfumed. On the other hand, if it's not giving you much of a scent and you have to stick your nose way in the glass, it's either called a neutral wine or it's muted in its aromatics. So what do you smell? There are at least 200 compounds in wine that we can perceive. For example, we're going to talk about a chemical called methoxypyrazine in Lecture 6 when we talk about Cabernet Sauvignon. This is a chemical that I'm particularly sensitive to, and I think I'm allergic to it, which is the reason why I'm sensitive. It's a green bell pepper kind of aroma that you can get in Cab. But other people can't smell this chemical, and we call that an anosmia. It's when someone cannot smell a specific aroma. But don't worry about any specific things that you can't smell, because they're going to be smells that you may get that other people don't. This is what makes wine such a personal and intimate experience, because although there are similarities when we could all point to, no one person perceives a wine exactly the way that you do. Now, the truth is that many of us have problems identifying aromas. That's because we don't train our nose the way we do our eyes. We can tell the difference between royal blue, aqua, and teal, right? That's because we pay much more attention to sight than smell. Start with whatever you can identify, no matter how silly, because it can bring you to other aromas. If it smells like Grandma's kitchen when she baked apple pie, then you got there. Start with things that you know. Does it smell like red fruit, black fruit, flowers? Start small, like writing intense red fruit aromas. It's not a contest to demonstrate that you can smell 25 different types of fruits. It's about pinpointing exactly what you recognize and then building on that. However, If you're just starting out and you're finding it difficult to pinpoint certain aromas, don't worry. You can actually train your nose. When I was first starting in the industry, I trained my nose on the Le Nez de Vin set, which means the nose of wine. It was created by Jean Lenoir, the author of the Le Nez de Vin collection, and it's these little bottles of essence, each one representing a different aroma that you get in wine. Now, all the aromas that you get in wine is not represented in this kit, but it can be quite helpful for you. When I was studying, I would ask my sister to blindfold me and then give me some of these bottles of essence. And after a while, I was able to say, wow, that's cherry. That's honey. And there are other fruits that you can get into wine. For example, lemons, raspberries, and other things like fresh cut hay, green bell pepper, and even things like leather. Now you can get the Le Nez de Vin collection at winearomas.com. But if you don't have a particularly big budget, you can always go to your pantry. You can go in there and grab honey. You can grab certain spices, but you may even want to go to your home closet and pick up a leather shoe or a leather belt. Now, I'm not going to say the wine is going to smell exactly like a leather belt, but you're going to get hints of these aromas. And the more practice that you get when you're smelling these different aromas around you, the better that you get at identifying wines. Now, you also hear the word mineral tones, especially with Old World wine. And what we mean by Old World wine is in Europe. Europe is known as the Old World. Everything outside of Europe is called the New World. But we hear this term mineral notes in the Old World. And it's kind of reminiscent of when you're walking along a sidewalk after a spring rain. Do you remember that aroma? It's kind of fresh and clean and it smells like pavement. That's what we mean by a mineral note in wine. Now, the term complexity, you'll hear this a lot with wine reviews and you'll hear critics talk about it, and it's a term that we refer to when we talk about quality. Now, complexity just means layers of flavors. Now, think of an ice cream sundae. Think of how it starts out, just plain Jane vanilla ice cream. And you may like just plain Jane vanilla ice cream. But then you have hot fudge. And then you have nuts. And then you put maybe some cherry sauce and whipped cream and a cherry on top. That's building flavors. And so an ice cream sundae, it's much more complex because it has many flavors versus your plain Jane vanilla ice cream. So that's the concept of complexity. It's a term that you'll learn to use. Now on to sip. Remember the sip I told you to take without thinking at the beginning of the lecture? Remember the flavor that you got? How much flavor did you get out of that? Now, to enhance your experience, what I want you to do is take a couple of tablespoons, maybe a tablespoon or two, really roll it around your tongue, hold it there for a second, and then swallow. Now, how much more flavor did you get out of that experience? Now, also, you really want to feel the weight of that wine in your mouth. And you'll hear sometimes people talk about light-bodied wines and full-bodied wines. And really, it's kind of like the analogy between skim milk, whole milk, and heavy cream. Here we have skim milk, we have whole milk, and we have heavy cream. Now, all of us can tell the difference between these in our mouth. Now, we can do this with wine. I'm not suggesting that these wines are going to taste as viscous as heavy cream, but it's an analogy to help you understand the difference between light-bodied and full-bodied. You'll also hear a term called a wine is thin. You may read that. And all that means is that the wine is delicately light-bodied and it's kind of dilute in flavor. As opposed to the opposite end of the spectrum, that if a wine is broad, then it's full-bodied and has much more flavor. Now, have you ever had a cold? How well do you taste when you have a cold? Okay, I want you to try something. I want you to hold your nose and taste while you're holding. You probably noticed that you really didn't taste anything. That's because what we qualify as flavors are actually aromas. And what's happening is when you swallow something, all those chemical compounds that you can perceive as aromas go up through your retronasal cavity, and you're able to perceive those as aromas. But when you have a cold, or if you hold your nose, you can't do that. Now, your tongue can only taste 5 things: sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami. We don't taste salt in wine, and we really don't taste umami, which is a savory taste like that in meat. But holding your nose while you taste it shut out these other influences of aroma that can disguise what you're tasting. I'm not suggesting you hold your nose while you taste, but it can help you perceive certain things about the wine in certain circumstances. For example, if someone says to you, "This wine has some sweetness to it," but you don't think so, hold your nose and do that test. I've done that myself. Sometimes what we perceive as sweetness is actually a very fruity aroma. Your tongue will tell you, and it won't lie if it's sweet. If you don't detect any sweetness on a wine at all, then we qualify that as dry. Dry is the opposite of sweet. They say that you can perceive sweetness at the tip of your tongue, but this is heavily debated as you have taste buds all over your tongue. But they say that you get it right at your tip. Acidity in wine is perceived as something sour, and acidity can be hard to get used to. My family's not really into wine, and when I was first starting in the industry, I brought home a special wine to share at Easter, a 1996 Grand Zechezot, which is a Grand Cru Burgundy. Well, I left the room for a minute, and they added 7-Up to it. A $200 spritzer. Yeah, they said the wine was sour. And they were right, actually, in one regard. It was made with a high acid grape called Pinot Noir. So they were right. We perceive acid on the tongue, on the sides of our tongue. And if a wine is particularly high in acidity, we can say that that wine is bright or crisp. If it's really acidic, we say it's racy. And in combination with a light body, we say it's austere. However, if the acidity is quite low in comparison to the other elements, the fruit and alcohol, we say the wine is blousy. Now on to bitterness. Think of dark French roast coffee or strong black tea, either taken black. They present a drying, tactile sensation on the middle and on the back of your tongue. In large amounts, this can be quite unpleasant. However, when bitterness is perfectly in balance with the sugar and acidity, it can be really quite pleasant. Bitterness can come from a group of chemicals called polyphenols. Tannin is a type of this chemical. Polyphenols come from grape skins, seeds, which they call pips, and stems, as well as from oak barrels. Polyphenols are more obvious in red wines than in white wines. However, you sometimes can get a phenolic or somewhat bitter sensation in whites. This is because there are many whites that have some skin contact with the juice prior to fermentation and are aged in oak. Lastly, you can get thermoreactions on your tongue. Think of how cool mint feels or how hot, spicy hot wings taste. This has nothing to do with temperature. It has to do with your receptors. Certain wines have some spice tones, but the warmth that you feel comes more from the alcohol level than anything else. Too much alcohol can feel too warm, and it can mute the flavors, and it can also feel like a bitterness on the back of your tongue. When you're tasting wine with your friends and you say the wine is really bitter, do the others agree? Do you find that many wines are just too strong for you? If so, it's possible that you're a hyper taster, or what we call a super taster. A super taster is just a person who has more taste buds on their tongue than the average person. So the flavors of food or wine are totally amplified. They're usually the people who add 4 teaspoons of sugar and heavy cream to their coffee. Do you prefer your food very, very spicy? If so, you might be what's called a non-taster. A non-taster has fewer taste buds than the average person, so a wine has to be high octane in fruit and bitterness for them to perceive it. So people vary not only in the aromas they can perceive, but in how their tongues work. Understanding this helps us to understand those tasting around us and to converse with them about wine. Savoring. Now comes my favorite part, savoring the wine. You've swallowed the wine, and it's time to meditate on the reactions in your mouth. This gives you the opportunity to run through all of the data that you collected through the other S's and come up with your own quality assessment. Now, one common misconception that I have to say is about quality. I've heard people say, I got this $5 wine and it's better quality than the $100 bottle of wine that I bought. Now, while you may enjoy the $5 bottle of wine and the price, the quality assessment for both of these will be quite different. A $100 wine should taste like a $100 wine. And if you can't tell the difference now, you should be able by the end of this course. However, people get personal preference mixed up with quality assessment. For example, if you don't like the flavors of butter and oak in your white wine, don't automatically jump to the conclusion that all oak Chardonnays are terrible quality. There are more objective parameters to quality. For the MW exam, I used 12 parameters of quality to assess and identify those 36 wines. But we'll just go through a few here. Firstly, look at the wine's finesse. Finesse is easier to define by looking at what it doesn't mean rather than what it does mean. The opposite of finesse is coarse. There are wines that are full-bodied and wines that are light-bodied and delicate, but both can have finesse. A wine with finesse is smooth and elegant. Think of Audrey Hepburn. Wines with finesse are generally of higher quality. Now let's think about the wine's balance. And you may need to take another sip to remind you. The term balance, or if a wine is well balanced, means that the wine's elements, fruit, acid, tannin, and alcohol, are working together. One doesn't overpower the other. If one of those elements sticks out in a truly obvious way, then the wine is said to be out of balance. Now, for example, the alcohol is way too warm and you can barely taste the other elements, or the wine has way too much oak, so the bitterness and the tannin cover up the fruit. When a wine has seamless balance, you can't really tell where one element begins and the other ends. It's kind of a dance where they're all there, but they're not stepping on each other's toes. Now taste a wine. How long did the flavor last? 10 seconds? 30 seconds? A minute? 5 minutes? There are some wines that are known to last for 10 to 15 minutes. How long the flavor lasts is a term we call length, and this is also linked to quality. And you'll hear critics talk a lot about length, but this is what it's referring to. You've also probably heard the term finish. Finish is another quality parameter, and it's a bit different than length, although many people use finish interchangeably with length. The finish is how the wine's flavor finally leaves your tongue. Did it finish clean and leave you prepared for that next sip? Or did it feel cloyingly sweet? Did it taste bitter or coarse? What's the flavor that lingers? What is the impression that you're left with? That's a wine's finish. Now, we discussed complexity earlier when we spoke of aromas. Complexity is definitely a parameter of quality. And the more layers of flavors you get, the better, although they should be pleasant flavors. There are other parameters, but this is enough to get you started. Now, putting it all together. When you taste a wine, it's okay to taste back and forth between the wines, but it's a good idea to wait about 30 seconds to a minute between wines to kind of recalibrate your palate. When doing so, it's also a good idea to have a glass of water or some neutral tasting crackers or bread. These aren't intended for your enjoyment, but to cleanse the palate of the influences between wines. It's not 100% necessary, but it may make tasting easier for you, especially when you're just beginning. There is something called palate fatigue, however. This is when you've tasted too many different wines and everything starts to smell and taste the same. So take your time. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Another tool in the Taster's Toolkit is glassware. We'll cover glasses when we go through lecture 24, but it's important to realize that the proper glassware can really add so much to the enjoyment of wine, as well as to how you perceive aromas. We have here glasses made by Riedel. They are hand-blown and some of the finest stemware in the world. The thin glass actually improves your perception of the wine in your mouth. Now lastly, unless your wine has a screw cap, then you're going to need a utensil for opening it, a corkscrew. It's also called a wine key in the industry. And here's how you properly open a wine. First, you take a foil cutter and you cut off the foil from the top. And here I have a foil cutter, which you can buy very inexpensively. Or on a waiter corkscrew, there is a knife that you can do this with. Now, there are different types of corkscrews. This is a waiter corkscrew. You may have also seen a winged corkscrew. And there's also one where it's a traveling corkscrew. It's called a screw pull because you put it in and all you do is pull it right out. Now, when you have a corkscrew, you take the coil, this part, and you put it in, you position it in the center of the cork. And you drill all the way down. Because if you only stop there, it's not going to work. So you have to go all the way down. And the great thing about a waiter corkscrew is that you can use leverage as opposed to just pulling straight out. So you can use the leverage here. And you pull up slowly, and you don't want to take it all the way out and make a large popping sound. What you want to do is grab your hand around it, just kind of wiggle it. Or if you have one of these fancy contraptions, what you do is you wrap it around, and you close your hand around the handle, and you go down, and you come up, and it's that simple. This is called a rabbit corkscrew. I guess because it looks like it has ears. There shouldn't be any loud popping sounds. And if you open a bottle too enthusiastically, you might spill. And there you have it. Next up, we'll be covering the basics of winemaking and how Mother Nature herself affects what we taste in our glass. You'll need the following two wines from the list from the back of the guidebook. A Chablis AC, which stands for Appellation Contrôlée, which we'll talk about in Lecture 10, and a South Australian Chardonnay. Well, I hope you enjoyed the Taster's Toolkit, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture.